Well, from one election to another, and a second day of voting is taking place in Russia's presidential election. Vladimir Putin is expected to win a further 6 years in power. His only serious opponents are either in prison, in exile, or dead. Authorities in Russia have called on security officers to be vigilant after vandalism at some polling stations on Friday. Let's discuss this now with Ben Dubo, Senior Fellow at the Centre for European Policy in Washington, D.C. Mr. Dubo, thank you very much for being with us. Good morning to you there in Washington. We've heard lots of reporting about the elections over the last few days, predominantly that it's a foregone conclusion. Why is the Kremlin going through this process if everyone seems to know the outcome already?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So Putin was actually trained as a lawyer, and he's been meticulously legalistic in his approach to dismantling democracy in Russia. So he actually initiated a constitutional referendum back in 2020 to change the constitution to allow for a third consecutive term of his serving as president. This is part of crafting an image of himself as a guarantor of order, as somebody who actually abides by the law as compared to the lawless West. And with the results of foregone conclusion, it also serves to reassert his role as the legitimate expression of the will of the Russian people.
Could you talk us through the mechanics of this election? Who oversees it, and how do they tie in with the Kremlin infrastructure?
Yeah, so the election's overseen by the Central Election Committee, or the CEC, which is run by Putin loyalist Ella Pamfilova. It's important to note that the stage is already set well before any votes are tallied, well before anything actually comes to the CEC. For instance, there's really no reason for Russians to disapprove of the ultranationalist candidate, Leonid Slutsky. He is constantly given a platform on state TV, rules in coalition with the incumbent United Russia Party. Nonetheless, he only polls about 7 to 10% approval rating. So what Putin has done through control over the media, through networks of largesse, is ensure that any opposition candidates or any candidates that can actually run are wildly unpopular. So while the CEC will investigate any irregularities that benefit opposition candidates, are very unlikely to investigate any irregularities that benefit Putin. Ultimately, the die is cast well before the voting starts.
If the die is cast, as you say, then how come we're seeing such high turnout numbers? Do people feel an obligation to go and vote for a president who's going to win regardless?
Yeah, so the turnout is actually going to be one of the main measures of success of this election for the Kremlin. Dmitry Peskov, the presidential spokesperson, has admitted that this isn't a real democratic election. It's more of a test of how well the bureaucracy functions. And so those turnout numbers are going to tell the Kremlin how well their regional allies, their local partners, can execute on orders that are coming from the Kremlin. The number to look out for here is 67%. That's what turnout was in the 2018 presidential election. On the first day of voting, turnout was about 33%. If that turnout matches that number between today and tomorrow, the Kremlin will consider the running of the election, the effectiveness of the bureaucracy, the ability of their regional allies to execute orders a success.
Okay, we will have to leave it there. Ben Dubo, Senior Fellow at the European Policy Centre in DC. Ben, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, the Estonian town of Narva is one of only a handful of places where the border between the EU and Russia is still open, but you can only cross on foot. Many of its residents are Russian and can go into Russia to vote in the presidential election. Oleg Boldarov sent this report from Narva.
Here in Estonian border town of Narva lies the frontier between the Western world and Russia. Across the river, with its formidable fortress, lies Ivangorod, a town 170 kilometers away from St. Petersburg. And this is one but a handful of places where the border between EU and Russia is still open. What's even more unusual that in this place, in the surrounding region, thousands of people are, in fact, Russian citizens. This is the legacy of Soviet Union breakup. In the 1960s and 1970s, people were brought from Soviet Union to work in local industries. And after the collapse of Soviet Union, they failed to get Estonian citizenship. This is the source of bitter arguments between the residents and the Estonian authorities, but the fact is that these people have applied and got Russian passports, and this means they can go and vote in the presidential elections which are taking place right now. The voting station is just across the bridge there. There weren't any big queues on this side of the border. We tried and looked for people who would cross over and vote, and most people were turning away. They're clearly not willing to talk about this. They're afraid that if they admit that they voted, this will somehow mean trouble for them. But one woman named Anna was not afraid to talk.
За Путина. Мне он ближе, он мне понятен. У меня характер такой.
I voted for Putin. He's closer to my viewpoint. I understand him. I have no doubts about him. I think every president should care for his country and his people. I see this in Putin. I have a sister there. My husband's brother is there. Our relatives are buried there. To cut us apart is painful.
We spoke to several more people who confirmed that they crossed the bridge and that they voted and they supported Mr. Putin. They were choosing their words very carefully. If they say that they support Mr. Putin and his war in Ukraine, this will certainly mean trouble for them here in Estonia. Their votes didn't matter much for Mr. Putin. His victory in this election is a foregone conclusion. Narva illustrates a very complex situation the Baltic states are in, nervously watching over their giant neighbors to the east, Russia. Oleg Boldarev, BBC News in Narva, Estonia.